Namaste and welcome back to Awaken Living with Nibodhi. In a lot of the healing circles, whether it's New Age healing or mindfulness or trauma work, there's a lot of discussion about the integration of light and shadow. And that's essential for spiritual growth. And ultimately, every tradition is rooted in this balance in integrating light and shadow. And any tradition that's rooted in self-realization as the ultimate goal arrives ultimately at the same truth. And that is that we do not become whole by avoiding darkness or avoiding the shadow. We become whole by bringing it to awareness, to remove it from the subconscious and bring it to the conscious. And today's discussion is exactly on this, light and shadow. And I thought that I would present my understanding of light and shadow from the Vedic perspective. In many people who are on the spiritual path, enter the spiritual path searching for peace, contentment, transcendence, bliss, or purity. But ultimately, that comes from the desire to be free from pain and suffering. And in the world, there's so much unresolved fear, shame, guilt, rage, jealousy, grief, lust, insecurity, the desire for control, trauma, and mostly unconscious desires remain active deep beneath the surface of awareness. And the spiritual practices that we do in any tradition, unfortunately, while they're designed to liberate us from those things, often suppress the same energy that we're trying to transform. And what that is called is bypass, spiritual bypass. And I know because I've done this. I've done this a lot throughout my life. And even that came from the unconscious, the subconscious. When a person speaks with love and kindness, but deep beneath that, they're grinding their teeth and filled with resentment, that's bypass. If we're using mantra or meditation to avoid intimacy, that's bypass. We preach non-attachment while inside we're actually craving validation. And this is not a new thing. Vedic wisdom traditions understood this profoundly thousands and thousands of years ago. In Vedic wisdom, in Vedic psychology, the human being contains multiple layers of consciousness. The Sanskrit term for that is the Koshas. And the shadow exists within us through all the koshas. There's 5 main koshas called the Pancha Maya koshas. There's the physical body, and in that lives our unresolved trauma, our unresolved tension, the stored trauma. And that's what develops our addictive behaviors. In the energy body, we have stagnant or blocked prana, and that's where our emotional stagnation comes from. In the mind body, the mental body, that creates our distorted beliefs and our unconscious reactive patterns. In the wisdom body, it seems that in wisdom, there's not going to be a shadow, but there is. It's spiritual arrogance or false identity. So many people think they're enlightened or they're gurus when they have plenty of issues that need to be dealt with. And in the bliss body, while that should be just pure bliss, if there's shadow, there's attachment to transcendence or to being in altered states and not actually showing up for the human experience. And so one thing that's really important to understand here is that the shadow's not evil. It's just unconscious. And the ancient Vedic text, the Bhagavad Gita, illustrates this through the inner battle between our higher wisdom and those lower impulses, those unconscious impulses. And the battlefield of the Kurukshetra symbolizes the field where the human psyche itself. And Arjuna is one of the main characters in the Bhagavad Gita. He represents the devotee or the sincere seeker who is just simply put overwhelmed by his own inner conflict. And his way of wanting to deal with it was to running and hiding in a cave. And Krishna, who is representative of Godhead, the awakened consciousness, is there to guide the soul, the individual soul, through confusion back to the union with his divine God self. So the spiritual path is often misunderstood as the destruction of human nature, but it's not at all, because human nature and divine nature is the same nature. It's just the spiritual path helps us to purify and integrate the human and the divine. Again, those aren't actually two separate things. It's just a disconnect in our consciousness. In Ayurveda, that imbalance begins when consciousness forgets its natural state of consciousness. It forgets the natural harmony of the universe through a process called prajnaparad, which is very simply the mistake of the intellect. It's we forgot who I am is. We forgot our true self. And in Ayurveda, the doshas actually influence how shadow will manifest psychologically. So I want to spend some time going over the doshas and how that shows up in our consciousness, because that's very important to understand if we want to understand ourselves and integrate all parts. For a Vata constitution, remember Vata is made up of the air and space element. Vata shadow shows up as anxiety, very often fear, when really pronounced disassociation or the desire to escape, escapism, and inconsistency, overthinking, rumination, going over the same thing over and over again in the head, and even spiritual fantasy, thinking something's other than how it is. An imbalanced Vata person is often attracted to mystical ideas, but completely unable to ground that in reality. And they chase these spiritual highs to avoid embodiment. And so for a Pitta, the Pitta shadow is often engaged in judgment, a lot of judgment, thinking they are holier than thou, and that their way is the only way. And when people don't follow what they say, that leads to anger. Pittas are also really dominated by control or the feeling of a spiritual superiority, and often undergo rigorous spiritual practices, that harsh discipline in the name of spirituality. But it's a spiritual ego more than anything. And an imbalanced Pitta seeker often becomes very rigid and identified with being advanced or pure, a great yogi, a great sadhak. Again, that holier than thou concept. And for a Kapha, their shadow is often associated with attachment or dependency, emotional repression or suppression, and a very strong resistance to, first of all, what is, and second of all, to change. And even a passivity, a lethargy. What does it matter? Nothing matters. A Kapha imbalanced person very frequently will cling to comfort and avoid the things necessary to elicit that transformation. And Ayurveda teaches us that if we want to be whole, it requires awareness of these tendencies without the guilt, without the shame, without being wrong, without it actually being a fault. These are all conditions. The doshas are not fundamental flaws of consciousness. They're just energetic patterns, energetic conditions that ultimately do want balance. And likewise, each of the doshas, everything in nature has a guna, a quality, a manasa guna, a quality to it. And so there's three qualities: sattva, rajas, and tamas. Tamas is inertia, it's darkness, it's the ignorance of who we truly are. And when that's predominant, it leads to an internal emotional and mental numbness. It can lead to depression or delusions, while the rajasic person is agitated frequently, very restless and emotionally reactive. And that leads to over ambition or unguided ambition and unregulated desire, which is very destructive. And then there's the sattvic quality, which is our natural state. It's a state of clarity and the state of harmony and compassion and love and truth. And through experience, it leads to wisdom. And the truth is, most seekers, most yogis only want the sattvic quality. But transformation requires conscious engagement with rajas and tamas as well, because within that tamas is our buried pain, is the suppressed, depressed, repressed emotions. And rajas does contain an emotional fire and desire, but they need to become conscious. Before sattvic quality really stabilizes, we need to bring the rajas and tamas to the light of day. And that's where yoga happens. That's where consciousness happens. It's not through repression. It's through transformation and awareness, and the realization that every force in existence contains a beautiful divine potential if it's approached consciously. If we can come to our desire mindfully, it can become devotion. We can transform our anger into clarity. Our fear can become a very, very wise presence. Even our sexual energy can be transformed into spiritual vitality. In fact, that's what it is. It's the energy that created the universe. It's the energy that creates anything. It's a matter of what we want to do with it. It's the creative potential of everything. Our grief can be transformed into compassion. And the ego, which we need to function in the material world, the goal is not to kill the ego. If we kill the ego, we're not here. We can't be here. We need it, but we need it to become a servant instead of our master. So the Vedic wisdom sees shadow simply as stuck or trapped prana or Shakti, because Shakti is life force itself. Prana is life force itself. And when consciousness, the higher consciousness, rejects parts of itself, that energy becomes fragmented. In some circles, they call that lost soul parts. In shamanic traditions, it's lost soul parts, and we have to do soul retrieval. The suppressed emotions don't just disappear. They move into our body and create dis-ease. They move into the unconscious and shape our behavior without us knowing it, which is called samskaras, these patterns which are responsible for the cycle of birth and death and the cycle of ignorance. And when we do suppress the emotions, it creates really unhealthy mental patterns. It creates projections. It creates addiction, compulsive attraction, and very often that leads to self-sabotage. Even though we know the right thing to do, we do the opposite. And in that, we become very emotionally volatile. And it's hard to have a relationship with an intimate partner, with family, with friends, with community, because we don't actually have a real relationship with ourselves. It creates this whole false spiritual identity. And there was a Western psychologist, or Western master really, Carl Jung, who actually echoed this exact understanding of this Vedic wisdom. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And the Vedic psychology understood this long, long before modern psychology, but it's true. We have to make the unconscious conscious if we want to be whole. And one of the deepest Vedic principles is that liberation comes from the expansion of consciousness, not the rejection of its existence. In yoga, in Vedic Sanskrit, there's a word called spanda, which is the pulsation of consciousness itself. And in that, light and shadow are both movements within that same field of consciousness, that same field of awareness. And we need to learn to witness all the internal states without collapsing into identifying who we are as those states. And that doesn't really mean that we indulge every impulse. It's not about hedonism. It's about disciplined awareness, right? For example, sexual energy is neither suppressed nor compulsively expressed in true consciousness. Anger doesn't need to be exploded or denied. And same thing, fear is neither to be obeyed and it's not to be shamed. Desire, we don't want to reject our desire, and we don't want to worship and follow every desire we have. We need to allow awareness to enter into our consciousness, into our experience fully, wholly, completely. And if we don't do that, we suffer. We suffer a lot, physically, mentally, emotionally. Yoga describes that through the Kleshas, the 5 Kleshas. These are the root afflictions to the mind, these Kleshas. And one of them is called avidya, and that's the main one. Avidya, it's the ignorance of our true nature. It's the not knowing who we are. When we don't know who we are, we look for it often in the wrong place. We look for it outside of ourselves instead of looking within. There's a story that I've heard over and over again throughout my life. Once God said, I'm going to play a game called hide and seek. And he called all these celestial beings, where should I hide? And one celestial being said, let's hide at the bottom of the ocean. And God said, no, that's too easy. Humans will go swimming. They'll go diving. They'll get there. Another one said, hide at the top of the highest mountain. He says, they'll figure out how to climb. He said, hide on the moon. Well, they'll figure out how to go there as well. Hide in deep space. No, they'll develop telescopes to look there. And then finally, one said, I know where to hide inside of themselves. It's the one place we forget to look for the divine inside of ourselves. So the first one's called avidya. It's the ignorance of who we are. The second one is called asmita, which means we're identified who we are is with the ego, with our likes, our dislikes, our attachments, our aversions, which are the next two. But we identify with our thoughts and our beliefs and our body. We have complete misidentification with consciousness. And from that comes raga and vesha, our attachments and our aversions. We are firmly attached to what we like and what brings us temporary comfort, and we firmly avoid what brings discomfort. But it's usually those things that are going to challenge us to look within. And then the final one is called abhini vesha, which is the fear of death or clinging to life. And it's interesting because I heard that that's actually the second greatest fear humans have. The first greatest fear is public speaking. And that makes sense because if we're an ego instead of consciousness, we're afraid of what people think, if they like us, if they don't like us. But in the yogic tradition, the fear of death, clinging to life, because ultimately what's afraid to die is just the ego. If we were firmly established in the self, death is not the end. It's a beautiful, blissful experience merging back into ourself. So all of these shadows coming from the 5 kleshas, they all just form around our unconscious patterns. And again, we're not wrong, we're not bad for having them. They're conditions. They're conditions of a society. And there's another saying, it's by Krishnamurti. He said, it's no sign of health to be well adapted to a sick society. And that's what we've done. We've learned to adapt for survival purposes to a very sick society, but that's not thriving. And so many people on the spiritual path become trapped in this subtle asmita, this ego identification. And what happens there is we create a spiritual ego. And that, on some level, I think is more harmful than just an ordinary ego. Because on the spiritual ego, we identify as being the healer, and that you're here to heal someone else, or that you're enlightened, or that you're an empath, or that you're a guru, or that you're a conscious partner, or you're a great yogi, or you're a pure vegan. Whatever it is, we identify with something that we think is divine and holy because we want to step out of ordinary consciousness, but it's still a subtle ego trap. And it's a way that the ego survives. It survives by becoming spiritual. Now it's a spiritual ego versus an ordinary ego, but it's still ego. And this creates a hidden shadow because in that spiritual ego, we're unable to admit that we still have insecurity, that we still have jealousy, resentment, envy, fear, loneliness, lust, all these things. They're still there. They're just hiding away, masked by being holy. So anything that ultimately threatens the spiritual self-image gets pushed down, pushed away. And that creates issues in our tissues. It still is a dis-ease. When we're really on the spiritual path, real yoga, I'm not talking about bending in different shapes, doing sun salutations, but real yoga, the union, it includes all dimensions of the self unified in conscious relationship with each other. And that's what the true yogic practice is designed to do. It's shadow integration work. And it's not linear. How that happens is not linear. There's no time frame on it. But the practices that we would traditionally do to wipe away the cobwebs of the mind is the meditation practices, the self-inquiry practices, breath work, bhakti yoga, devotional practices, singing bhajans, kirtan, doing mantra, trying to engage in conscious relationships, surrounding yourself with people who will actually call you on your shit when you're out of integrity, doing seva or karma yoga, taking time for silence, taking time for fasting, doing spiritual practices, doing tapas. I'm very excited to share with you Real Mushrooms, the sponsor of the Awaken Living podcast. I use their mushrooms every single day because they've genuinely changed my life. I trust them because they have more than 50 years of expertise and use only 100% organic mushrooms, 0 grains, 0 fillers, which are found in most of the common mushroom products on the market. They use just real, organic, clinically tested mushrooms. Every morning, I use lion's mane to sharpen my thinking. I use cordyceps to give me clean energy I need for the day. I use chaga to strengthen my immune system, and when stress hits, and it does, I use reishi to bring me back to center. With their products, you actually feel the difference. And if you'd like to experience that for yourself, click on the link in the show notes or visit realmushrooms.com and use the code AWAKEN20 for 20% off your first order. Tapas is actually really important. It's the word, it means fire, but it means conscious friction or a sacred discipline. And the reason that we want to do some kind of tapas is that that's where the growth occurs. Growth really only can occur when awareness is present inside of our discomfort. We need to stop trying to escape discomfort. We need to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. We need to be okay, sometimes not being okay. Right? But without that tapas, without that some kind of conscious friction lighting the fire burns away everything that's not true. The shadow will continue to remain hidden. And again, that's the unresolved samskaras. These unresolved samskaras are what shape our shadow. They're the subconscious impressions that have been adapted, created through our past experiences, the conditions, the repeated actions, and definitely the traumas. Because these impressions influence our attraction patterns. What are we attracting to us? Why do we keep attracting the same harmful relationships? These are what are our emotional triggers. When something very small and simple happens, we create a big reaction. It's something buried deep inside us called intrinsic memory. The samskaras are our habits and our fears and the unhealthy relationship dynamics, and all the identity ego structures we've surrounded ourselves with to protect us from feeling. And we've heard of the dark night of the soul, right? Or the Saturn return. Many of our spiritual crises come because when we start doing spiritual practices, it dissolves the illusions we hold so tightly to. It dissolves and breaks down the wall that protected us. It dissolves the samskaras. And in my experience, what's happened when I've done these spiritual practices is that I was left with really intense grief and irrational anger and flooded with emotions that felt very overwhelming. And the old ego identity started to collapse. And that can create confusion. And that's why we actually need someone who has done this work to help us if we don't have enough tools on our own. The word guru means the remover of darkness, the bestower of light. The true guru doesn't want anything from us. The only role of a true guru is to remove the ignorance of who we are and show us who we really are, who we think we are. It's removing the ignorance of who we think we are, the ignorance of the self, and showing us the self. It's a big flashlight. And if there's a light and there's a form, there's a shadow. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? So if we are having grief, anger, fear, confusion, deep emotions, that's not failure. That's purification. Some people think I sit down and meditate and do mantra and you're supposed to attain bliss instantly. The yogi spent decades, lifetimes doing this. So what this really is the samskaras are being uprooted. So if you are doing spiritual practice and you're experiencing these things, it's normal. You just need to find someone to help guide you through it. Okay? Because as our awareness deepens, the unconscious material is going to rise into our consciousness to be witnessed, to be held, and to be released. And that requires safety. That requires a grounding, loving, compassionate presence, and someone who has unconditional love that can hold us in that and show us the way out of hell. Ayurveda helps too, because Ayurveda has so many tools that can help us to stabilize our nervous system while we're doing the spiritual work. Because excessive meditation or too much spiritual practice without grounding will aggravate vata and it will destabilize the mind. And so we need help. And so Ayurveda gives us really fun things to do. Eat warm, nourishing foods. Yay, very easy. Have consistent routines. That's easy. Mostly. Spend time in nature. Put oil on your body. Abhyanga, the oil massage. Surround yourself with sangha, with satsang, with conscious community, with other people who are doing the work. Have healthy intimacy. Don't look at the internet for intimacy. There's nothing to be found there. Have rest. Acknowledge that this is intense work and that the body needs rest, that the soul needs rest. But you still need to move the body. Do physical movement. Just going for a walk in nature, going for a walk on the beach, doing some gentle restorative or yin yoga, doing very slow, gentle breath work. But we need to, first of all, detach from the overstimulation. Stop scrolling on the internet. Stop spending so much time looking for our validation on our Facebook posts, on our Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is. We need to become embodied. That matters. Okay? And we need to make sure that we don't glorify transcendence and neglect the body. So many spiritual traditions do this. They mistake transcendence for holiness and neglect the body. The body is holy. The body is divine. It was made in the image of God. God created this beautiful body. And the body stores our karma. The body stores our memory. It stores emotion. It stores thought. And stores also the wisdom and intelligence of the universe. We need to see the body as sacred. But the body is a divine messenger. and it gives us signals, just like the car dashboard. If the oil needs changing or the tire air pressure is too low, there's warning signs. We need to pay attention to that. The body reveals where there's stuck emotion, where there's shadow, when we have chronic tension, when there's misuse of sexual energy, sexual dysfunction, when our digestive system is imbalanced, when we're holding our breath or there's an imbalance in our breath, when we feel fatigued, when there's nervous system dysregulation. These are all signs, they're warning signs from the body that the shadow is being trapped and it needs healing. But to have that healing, it requires listening to the body instead of dominating it. We try to dominate everything. We try and dominate our body just like we dominate nature. And within the body, there's an energetic system called chakras. Everyone's heard of chakras, right? They also profoundly reflect how well we're integrating the shadow, because each chakra contains a higher energy and a distorted expression. The root chakra shadow is our survival instinct, our survival fear. And we live in a mindset of scarcity and disconnect from the body. Whereas the second chakra, the sacral chakra, is our addictions and our emotional volatility and our sexual guilt and shame. And a lot of that comes from religion and societal conditions or family conditions. The solar plexus is our power, our control, our aggression, and our power structure when it's engaged in the shadow. The heart is the codependency issues or emotional armoring, protection, or martyrdom in some cases. The throat represents the fear of expression. We're suppressing our natural voice. We're suppressing saying what we actually feel and think in a protective mechanism, because if we feel like we can speak what we want freely, our life may be in danger. That's happened throughout society. So the throat chakra is dealing with suppression, and when it's malicious, it's dishonesty. The third eye leads to delusion, fantasy, spiritual inflation. And when we're having shadows stuck in the crown, it's total disassociation, false transcendence, and we escape reality, which is here and now, in and through the body. And so if we want to bring the subconscious conscious, it is going to require that these chakras become integrated and conscious. And that's one of the deepest teachings of the Vedic tradition. It's the union of Shiva and Shakti, of divine masculine, divine feminine, the divine witness, pure awareness with the manifested forms of awareness. Shiva is the pure consciousness. Shakti is the dynamic life force. They must exist together. Light without shadow integration is sometimes detached transcendence, and shadow without consciousness is chaos. Wholeness emerges only when these are unified. And this integration changes our relationships profoundly. It changes everything. It changes life. Again, when we have an unintegrated shadow, we're going to project our shit onto our partners. We can have emotional dependency. We may have attraction to chaos. We may fear intimacy. We may have hidden manipulation complex or a savior complex. But if we can bring that to awareness, we can breathe into that, we can be with that, we can be honest with ourselves and integrate that shadow, we come to having compassion. We come to authentic communication. It builds stability. We have healthy boundaries. We can have erotic maturity. Eros is the love of the universe. Erotic does not mean promiscuity or lust. It means we're in love with the universe. We're in love with the creation. The flower blooming is incredibly erotic, but it's through a stable, compassionate, emotionally honest viewpoint that eros, that love, that creative power of the universe blossoms. And a spiritually mature person it's not that they don't become emotionless. They don't disappear. There's consciousness with deep emotion. The emotion is unconditional love. There's no pretense in that. There's no pretending. This is why there's such a bad gurus get a bad rap, because there's so many gurus and spiritual leaders who publicly collapse because they've denied the shadow. And any shadow that's denied eventually becomes enacted. And so they've got some cities, they've got some spiritual powers, and it amplifies their unconsciousness. So without humility and without doing the tapas and without the self-awareness, that sexuality becomes exploitation. Devotion becomes control and manipulation. Wisdom turns into narcissism. And you can see it all the time. Spirituality becomes performance-based. And thousands of years ago, the Vedic tradition warned against this. The Upanishads describe the senses like wild horses, all pulling in different directions. Awareness must guide them consciously with one pointed, focused direction. And suppression of those energies fails. Indulgence fails. We need the middle path. The Buddha talked about the middle path. The middle path requires a conscious, awakened relationship with all of the human energies, and to stop seeing them as less than divine. They're part of the creation. They're part of consciousness. But they need to be integrated. And the biggest thing is that we need compassion. We need self-compassion. We need self-compassion. It becomes essential. If we want to really evolve, we need compassion for ourselves. Okay? Because the shadow integration is not about self-condemnation or harsh judgment. If we're judging ourselves, that strengthens our fragmentation. That strengthens the ego. We need awareness with honest transformation. It's only through awareness that we can transform. There's another concept in the Vedic tradition called Sakshi Bhava. It's the inner witness. It's the state of the inner witness where we observe. We simply observe with curiosity. We can observe fear without becoming fearful. We can observe anger without becoming anger. We can observe our desires without becoming the desire itself. And when we can observe these things, that alone creates the freedom. And for that, it does help. Truly, it really helps to have a meditation practice, because it's in that meditation practice that cultivates the witness consciousness. And then it's not just sitting with your eyes closed in lotus position. It's in daily life. Daily life is school. Life is the school, love is the lesson. We've heard this before. But life becomes the real laboratory to determine how well we've succeeded in dealing with these things. Because if we're constantly being triggered, that's a great thing to be aware of, because that's going to reveal the shadow. Our relationships dramatically reveal where we're still attached. Our cravings reveal where we still have wounds. And our judgments can reveal the parts of ourself that we rejected. So spirituality becomes real when awareness is there in everyday, ordinary human experience. Can you remain peaceful, calm, compassionate when someone cuts you off without turning on their blinker? Or the person in front of you is going 10 miles an hour under the speed limit, and you have a concept of when and where you want to be, right? It's in everyday life. If the cashier at the grocery store is just having a conversation with the person in front of you after they've paid for their groceries, and you just want to get home and make your meal, can we stay in consciousness then? Can we stay in love then? Okay. The integrated consciousness is about becoming human. You're not going to disappear. You're not going anywhere. When you're integrated, you're grounded. You're emotionally honest. You're compassionate. You're embodied. You're stable. And in that, there's a deep, profound aliveness. There's no more performance. You're just present. And this is also modeled in The Advaita Vedanta, that's the non-dual. Even in Advaita Vedanta, light and shadow are there. They just dissolve into pure awareness. Consciousness contains all the pairs of opposites: birth, death, creation, destruction, pleasure, pain, form and formlessness, masculine, feminine, stillness, movement. It all exists, even within the non-dual. Because within, even to say non-dual, there's dual in there, right? But we're just no longer fragmented. We no longer have fragmented parts of ourself. Everything is accepted. And that doesn't mean that we remove discernment. Harmful behavior still requires boundaries and responsibility. But internally, something changes. There's no longer us and them. There's no longer enemies. We're no longer identifying with the victim that they did something to us. That shadow part becomes integrated. But we need to develop these things. We need to develop the awareness and the compassion and the embodiment. But that requires some kind of discipline. And this is not going to happen overnight. It's lifelong. Every stage of awakening happens in its own time. There's subtle layers. There's our personal shadow. There's the generational shadow, generational trauma. There's relational shadow. There's collective shadow. There's a spiritual shadow. We live in form. There's light and there's dark. That will create form. So our path matures from seeking something outside of ourselves to seeking being our own self, our true self, to living in wholeness. Real spirituality is nothing about becoming just pure light and dissolving into bliss forever. That will happen eventually, until forever creates itself all over again. But it's real spirituality. It's about becoming conscious enough to hold the light and shadow without losing connection to truth, to love, and to presence. So that's my understanding of the integration of light and shadow on the spiritual path through my own experience, through the Ayurvedic lens, through the Vedic lens of what I've learned and experienced in this life. So I hope that some part of this resonated with you and that it's useful for you and beneficial and can support you on your journey into that integration. And if you did find value in today's discussion, please share it with someone else on the path. It's through sharing our experience and sharing what we've learned and what we haven't learned, what works, what doesn't work, that we grow. So also feel free to leave your comments, share your experience. And through these conversations, we grow in love, we grow in light, we grow in our integration process. And if we fail, the failures are our greatest success if we can meet them mindfully. We're not wrong, we're not bad, we're not good if we succeed. We're just humans having a spiritual experience. We're spirit beings, we're consciousness having a human experience. It's all of it. It's all the same. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. And may your hearts be filled with the light of awareness and take that into everything you do. Before you go, if you've been curious about Ayurveda and want to actually understand your body and start applying it into your daily life, I built the complete Ayurveda course for exactly that. It contains more than 30 years of education and practice distilled into 50 lessons, with over 10 hours of content, guided meditations, personalized assessments, and so much more. It's designed so you'll feel real shifts as you go through it. You'll experience more energy, better digestion, increased mental clarity, and a deeper sense of balance. Lesson by lesson, it's all there. So go to Nibodhi.com/courses to learn more.